So, John, chapter 5 is titled Clouds, and it's a poem, and it's just full of, how I would put it, wisdom. I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about your poet side and how this poetry comes to you and comes out of you, and also how maybe it has been a big part of your spiritual journey.
Well, it's nice of you to say it. There's wisdom in this one, because I must have written it at least 40 years ago. And it was the first of what I might call my spiritual poems. And how it arose, I really can't tell you, as I can't tell you where. Well, I could say more on this, but it's very mysterious how, I don't know if it happens to everybody, but at least to some people, things just come into the mind and you write them down. Where did this poem come from? I really can't tell you, but I do remember sitting up. I was living on my farm at that time. Sitting up, I had a little room at the top of the house looking out over my fields. And I sat at my desk there and more or less just wrote this out. Of course, I've polished it a bit over the years and changed a word or two, but basically it's the same verse. Some of you may have seen a little brochure that I printed it out on and used to hand out to people. Where do these things come from? God knows. And over the years, I've written hundreds of poems. In fact, my last book, that isn't published yet, has nearly 100 poems in just the one book. Many of them are only just short, 4 or half a dozen lines, but they just keep popping up. I don't know, I write them down. And really strange to say, I've never actually written a book. I've never sat down and, with the intention of writing a book. I've never sat down and spent an hour or two a day writing. I just don't do that. But just words come into my mind, and as long as I have a notebook and write them down, then that's what my books consist of. So I can't really say I've written any book myself. Well, I trust this very much. In fact, throughout my life, I've come to trust my own thinking process less and less. I really don't think anything much of the human mind, really, compared to what it is that comes in from, as we say, God knows where. Which seems to be of an altogether, perhaps more authentic, really, more real, perhaps that's a word I could use, more real than anything that comes out of John Butler. This is extraordinary, really. In fact, this might lead me on to say that having now had quite a bit of experience of public speaking, I never know what I'm going to say. Even when I'm addressing a conference or a big meeting, I never ever prepare anything. I never have any notes. The only thing I try to do is, guess what? Feet on the ground, listen and look, feel the stillness, and trust that. What comes out? Where does it come from? God knows. Maybe that's why quite a number of people seem to appreciate it. We talk a lot about the ego, really, and me, but the more one gets the sense of the actual functioning reality of this higher dimension of life, the spirit, I suppose, the more this sort of human puppet called John Butler really loses its authenticity. I mean, it's there, we live with it, it's an instrument. I mean, this is the one, this is the voice that speaks, isn't it? This is the hand that actually writes the letters on a bit of paper. But its validity is from this higher authority. Yes, I like that phrase, higher authority. It's literally what it is. It's like an author. The real author is this, it's the spirit. And this is just the pen that writes. So that's wandered a bit from this subject, clouds, but this clouds is the first of my when I was at school, I was taught to write poetry. Of course, in those days, I remember I had a very good English schoolmaster, and most of the English was based really on the Bible and what's called the English Book of Common Prayer, which goes back to the year 1666. So it's been around for 300 years. And it was before modern intellectuals started translating the Bible into what they thought was more understandable language. So I was brought up on this rather old-fashioned language, which really was marvelously profound and poetic in its form. I can still quote you now, long passages of those old prayers and passages from the scripture that I was taught. And in those days, poetry had to rhyme. It was essential. It had a rhythm and a rhyme, a structure to it. And when it was just the beginning, a few sort of modern people were beginning to write poetry that didn't rhyme. And I remember him saying, he was very scathing about it, saying this isn't proper poetry. So I rather lived with this attitude all my life. And now I see almost nobody writes poetry now with a rhyme or rhythm. It's really what you might call poetic prose, really. But anyway, I've just stuck to the old ways. All my poetry rhymes, all of it. So if people don't like rhyming poetry, you won't like mine. But if you do, then you might find something in it. So however spiritual it is, or from higher authority, it still comes down into manifestation with a rhyme and a rhythm. So maybe that's how higher authority wants it. God knows. I love that phrase, God knows. It takes me off the hook, doesn't it? I pass the buck back up here. God knows, and I do not.
John, I'm stealing that. God knows. I'm stealing it. We need t-shirts, John.
God knows. And
God knows.
That would be a good slogan, yes. I'd approve of that.
I do have a question. Well, it's not really, just maybe something you could maybe go a little bit deeper. You know, in all the videos on YouTube that I have watched, you, and even speaking to you in person, you often give the analogy of rising above the clouds, and obviously this poem is about that. And in the poem you write, we think of so many by day and by night that we almost smother out our inner light. Yes. And then the conditions are the clouds, and they cannot be me, which to me, obviously intellectually makes a lot of sense. But when we're deep in the suffering of our own clouds, what advice could you give to us on how to move through that?
Well, the only advice I can give to anybody is the discipline of practice. You see, we can't. We're under the weather, as it were. And the clouds are bigger than you and me. So in my case, I plod up the hill to church, I sit down and I meditate. I may have forgotten what I do it for. I may have completely, it's just a nuisance. It's just something I've just sort of gotten locked into my system. So I do it. And it usually, often, some time after I've sat to meditate, it begins to dawn on me what I'm doing it for, the purpose of it. Because then you might get a chink of light coming through the clouds. But sometimes you don't. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes you just have the clouds for days on end. what can you do? Not much. Suffer. Sometimes when they're really awful, exactly, we suffer. You know, Christ suffered, so why shouldn't we? You know, it's part of life, isn't it? Why do we think we know better than the clouds? Perhaps they're sent to humble us. Oh, it's very interesting being old, you know, looking back. I begin to think all the many years of depression and cloudiness that I've lived through were for a very good reason. I really do. I can never take, happy people that seriously. I think they haven't lived enough. We've got tears for a reason. I'll tell you a little story. Just this week, there's a young man in Russia who corresponds with me, and he wrote rather a confident letter saying, what he's discovering and how he's seeing life as beautiful. But then he couldn't help just adding in a few rather bitter words about politics. So I wrote back and tried to point out that with practice, even he'll see even what the things that he doesn't like now. I can't remember just what I said, but anyway, I told him that all things are for the best and have a reason. Anyway, and encourage him to keep being present, keep looking. Well, he wrote back again, and he said, yes, the more I look, the more of the human suffering I see. I thought, well, perhaps I was a bit naive in telling him to see the beauty in everything. So when I write back, I'll say, yes, but keep practicing for 60 years, my dear. And then you may begin to see beauty not only in the nice birds and the bees, but in all what normally appears the dreadful aspects of human life. But you see, it depends on the purity of the perception, and we're sort of so conditioned to impurity. Our not only our physical eyes, but the eyes of our hearts are so embedded in criticism and division that we just can't live up to the biblical words, to the pure, all things are pure. It takes probably a lifetime of purification before that begins to come into reality. Practice. A whole lifetime of practice is required to see the beauty in everything and see the perfection, not only the beauty, but perfection. It's quite easy to, you look at hair, for example. Just look at the hair in the back of your hands, for example. Every hair is perfect, isn't it? Every hair is there for a reason. Look into an ant heap and see the ants and see the beauty of it. Just look at a field of grass, how every blade of grass is perfect, how it all works together. And then amongst the grass are a myriad of insects. And is it not all perfect? And look deeper into the earth, isn't every grain of dust perfect? Every stone, every rock, every color of every little bit of lichen and light on the earth and the grass, the trees. Is anything in this world not perfect? Until, of course, a man comes along, and then, of course, the whole edifice crumbles, doesn't it? And you can't bear him, or he talks and he just drives you nuts. And you lose all that beauty and just enter into conflict. Well, this is man's misfortune. You see, this is why man's called a sinner. And my God, we're all sinners up to the neck, from head to foot. And that's why we die. But that's another long story. I won't go into that one now. But you see, it takes much practice, especially to take on the human world and see first of all, how everything is as it is. It's all cause and effect. The consequence of one thing leads to another, you see. Because we've left we've left that original perfection and fallen into what's called sin, which is this ego, this separate existence that separates us not only from the grass but from each other, from the animals, from the sky, from nature. That's why we live an unnatural life and build unnatural cities, and the whole world is not natural but unnatural. This is our problem, isn't it? Yes, we have to deal with that, and by purifying perception, widen our understanding of what is nature, until we begin to see perfection in imperfection and nature in what is unnatural.
I appreciate you mentioning suffering, and I don't know if there's beauty in suffering, but on my own experience, there's been a lot of growth coming through suffering. And I don't know if it's just me, but my big life lessons, and I feel have always come through suffering. So I appreciate you talking about that. But in the poem, back to coming to your poem on clouds, you write about who writes a recipe makes a rule, but if you observe them, experience shows when clouds are surmounted, our confidence grows. And I think you and I have talked about this before, about sticking with it. And again, the suffering. And here you talk about our confidence grows. You talk a little bit more about that, like the confidence in maybe doing the work, or the confidence in not giving up.
This last week or two, we're speaking now a couple of weeks, is it? We've got 3 weeks, maybe 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks since our Queen died. And millions of people have been strangely, perhaps unexpectedly, and deeply stirred by this. And on the radio, we've heard reporters going around asking people about their feelings, because very few people have the language to express it clearly. But they talk of becoming emotional. It's a funny thing that we often talk of being emotional with some embarrassment, as though it's something that isn't quite normal. But there's absolutely nothing wrong in being emotional. Emotional is really what we call from the heart. And in spiritual language, the heart is really a higher aspect of mind. It's love, really. And those of us, many people in the West, are rather shy of talking about love, especially in public. But love is of this higher dimension. It's from God, really. And when people are deeply stirred, it touches something in them that is perhaps not part of their everyday experience. And yet, it's unmistakable. And people will make huge efforts to follow it. There's a sort of a calling, an irresistible calling that comes with it, an instinct, a sort of higher confidence in something bigger than themselves. That's it, really. When we normally talk of confidence, we talk in confidence of our own ability, like passing an exam or something, or getting some qualification, or being able to ride a bicycle or do anything that you couldn't do before. So one builds up that sort of personal, me, John Butler confidence. Look at me, I can know how to milk a cow now. I've taken another step towards being, a proper grown-up farmer. But this is a higher level of confidence. It's a sort of a looking out at the horizon and up at the stars or something. And just as I'm looking out the window now, because it's dark outside, and there's a little star one of the first stars just twinkling outside through my window through a pane of glass. Do you know, that immediately fills me with such a wave of confidence. Sort of, I love the stars. I feel I can trust them. I belong up there, really. In a way, I don't really belong in this human world down here. Sort of, I feel, yes, confidence comes from something bigger than ourselves. This John Butler is altogether too fragile and wobbly a creature to really put much trust in it. You know, I can't remember anything these days. My mind wobbles around. I think one thing one day, something else the next. My body is all sort of wobbly, and I used to be strong. I'm not now. You know, that confidence goes. But on the other hand, this higher confidence grows ever stronger. I've never felt more sure of that higher confidence. It's marvelous to know that there's something infinitely bigger than John Butler holding me in its arms. Somehow, I feel only too ready to sort of to give up my own wobbly human nature and surrender to this with total confidence into this higher authority. Into thy hands, O God. God knows, and I do not. It's all the problems of the world now. I just feel totally confident in surrendering it to higher authority. And that, by the way, is exactly what's meant by prayers. That's just what prayer is. Just exactly what prayer is. So that's what I really consider my life's work is now. Prayer. Surrendering to higher authority. Total confidence. Yes, this human confidence is a very transitory thing. How can you trust what's here today and dead the next? Even civilization, they all come and they go, don't they? Well,
You know, John, as I'm reading your book, and I've watched a lot of your videos, and I'm so very grateful for the videos, but I see there's so much depth in the books. So for anyone watching this video, I really hope people will start reading your books more. They've been such a gift to me. And, you know, talking about this chapter 5, and now I don't know, I've probably read this poem 10 times, and every time I read it, I hear it differently. And now as you've elaborated on this higher spiritual confidence, you wrap up this chapter with the sentence, or you write, with confidence I pour it forth. It's so difficult to know something mentally. It takes longer for the whole man to conform to what is known.
Gosh, I'd forgotten that. I wrote that a long time ago. Not quite sure as I'd write the same thing now. With confidence, I poured it forth. Yes, I was saying earlier, I don't think it was me that poured it forth. It sort of poured forth from me. Although at that time, I certainly was. I used to do quite a bit of public speaking on meditation then, and it certainly was more me-based then than what I say now is. Yes, that's certainly true. With confidence, I poured it forth. It takes longer for, yes, any fool can know this stuff intellectually. Yes, you can read a book and go tell your pals about it and hold a discussion about spiritual work. You hear it all the time, people just quoting from other people. And then, of course, you come back to ordinary life and you don't live up to it at all, do you? It's just words in your head. But it takes a oh, I don't know that we ever really are able to live it out in practice. I wouldn't know whether I do or not really. I think most of what goes on in here and in here is untrustworthy, to say the least. And I wouldn't like to say that I conform to higher authority at all. I'm rather suspicious of those who think they do. I mean, the very fact that I die is a contradiction to this, which is immortal, isn't it? This is mortality, and that is immortality. So how can this conform to that? You can't. The flesh is, again, to be biblical, this is the wages of sin, which is death, and that's why it has aches and pains and things go wrong with it. Whereas in that, there's nothing goes wrong. This is perfection. But we do our best, I suppose. We try to speak the truth, but that's not so easy, is it? I'm always afraid once I get into a position like this that I'll say something stupid. The tongue's an untrustworthy creature, isn't it? It runs away with us before we know where we are. It's talking things you rather wish you hadn't said. I was at a funeral a couple of days ago at our local church. They read wonderful words. I'll tell you just where it was in the Bible. And it talks of the corruptible being made incorruptible. Well, this is the corruptible, isn't it? But this is not made incorruptible. It's that which it's the spirit, you see, that goes out at the time of death, that is incorruptible. Anybody that witnesses death, you see for yourself that this falls back, doesn't it, onto the bed and just dies and becomes nothing. And in a day or two, it's smelly, and then then the maggots start eating it. And what can you do with it? It just goes back to the earth, doesn't it? Whereas this goes up to freedom. You see it in animals, and of course, it happens to us. It's a marvelous experience to see a death if you get the chance. If you don't have a human death, at least observe it in nature, and you'll see what happens. Beautiful trees, they go back and rot away, don't they, to the earth. And the spirit goes back to God who gave it. So people go to great lengths to sort of purify the flesh, which is, you eat the right sort of vitamins and pills and things, and try to eat pure foods and all that. Oh, very good. But anyway, it has a limited benefit, doesn't it? However much you cleanse the body and do all that, the body's still going to die, isn't it? It's the spirit, really. That's why salvation of the soul is really the highest destiny of man, which is to recognize his identity with the spirit. And there you see, then suddenly purity becomes the reality of life. It's not something to sort of, you can't make spirit pure. Spirit is pure. The only way one can become pure is by letting go, you see, of the impurity, which basically is in here. It's in the mind. That's where the purification takes place. When the mind is pure, then the eye will be pure, and you'll see purity more. That's how it works. It's not so much that it's just that the impure, you don't see it. It's like darkness. You see, what happens to darkness when you switch the light on? What happens to it? Look. It's dark. What happens to the dark when I do that? There you are. Do it again. This is, I don't know. This is all the trouble. Look at me. shadow boxing, aren't I? Ah, all the monsters and the devils. Oh, God, it's terrible. Oh, I got frightened. Oh, poor little me, I'm all alone. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. God, save me.
It's a great virtual analogy, John. But again, it's like the intellectual connection is very clear, at least for in this example, but to then stick with it, to give the experience of having the light present, it just brings me back to what you always say, feet on the ground, 60 years of meditation. And I think sometimes we just get impatient, or always we're so impatient.
Well, of course, that's true. Yes, the old saying, practice makes perfect. Funny enough, yes, we're just talking about that, aren't we? Practice makes perfect. Yes, practice, my dears, discipline and practice. I don't really know. You know, people ask me, how do you do it? I'm so glad, by the way, you pointed that out, because I know myself there's a million times more in my books, really, than I know the videos. Most people know me through the videos and not really through the books, but there's so much more, and especially to young people that are just starting this work and are full of questions. Well, how do you do it, and how, there's looking for answers. My dears, just read my life story and you'll see how infinitely human I am, and there's almost nothing in the human world that I haven't been through. And every little detail, from exercises and all the loves and hates and things I've had to cope with in life, I think you'll find it ever so reassuring. I've got no answers in my books. It's just the story of an old man that's bumbled along, made no end of mistakes, and had a lot of unhappiness and troubles in my life, as well as a few nice moments. And I think you'll find just the daily plod, just carry on. I think this is why God gives us 80 years of life, and all the different experiences that life throws at it. They've all got their purpose. It's all just a great school in which we learn by everyday experience. And although we all try to plan our life out, life seldom works that way. Things happen that we never expected. And you get put into situations, you meet people you never expected, and it's extraordinary. One door closes, another opens all through your life. And eventually you begin to think, well, I really don't know. Who does? God knows. I'm very glad we're doing these series of interviews, and I do hope they'll encourage any spiritual aspirants to not only watch videos, but read books, because I'm sure you'll find ever so much help in them. Encouragement. Perhaps even more than help, encouragement. Encouragement from realizing you're not the only one in a mess, my dear.